Romans, and in some cultures, it also gets elevated to a different form of luxury. A ritual starts to surround it. The onsen bath by cable car in Japan is something I encountered over the research, which is just so interesting. But in its most basic form, when we think about hygiene systems, the architect, Alexander Hira, who wrote the seminal book on the bathroom, really reminds us that this really is just a container that holds waste and a container that holds water, and that's what we tend to work around. And so I wanted to include some imagery of standard sort of common bathrooms that people actually have. I think given the preponderance of designers present, we tend to be a very selective group in what we see in our mind's eye when thinking about bathrooms. The people who hire designers or can afford to are not most people by and large. And in doing research for this, talking to regular people was of course very helpful. And you can see the types of solutions that we tend to turn to, generally speaking: the elevated toilet seats, the use of shower chairs, the standing walk-in bathtub, which most people who actually use this complain about some of a lot of the issues it has. And so I think, from my perspective, and I think those of many people I've spoken to, I really believe that our current solutions are both quite fragmented, but really lack dignity in many ways. And so I wanted to play this video of an interview I did with a woman who really talks about the experience she went through with her father. I hope this plays so I don't have to put words in her mouth, but I think it's very compelling.
In December 2021, when my dad, who was otherwise a very healthy and young 74, had a catastrophic stroke. We moved him to an assisted living facility. The actual facility was some.
I'll try to do voice over what she's saying. They eventually bought a house in San Francisco and moved their father in with them and had to undertake a fairly expansive renovation of the bathroom. He really did not do well in assisted living. She talks at length about basically how ugly the environment was, the use of very medicalized grab bars all over the place. And so when they actually renovated their home, they had to use a lot of products, and they just did this in a very entrepreneurial way, she described, having to figure out how to effectively meet his needs. They used occupational therapists, but ultimately worked with general contractors to just try to figure this out. And later learned that they made a lot of mistakes. They wanted black grab bars from Kohler, but they turned out that those were not made really as well, because they're not used in those hospitals, in hospital settings or other areas where they can be bought in high volume. And so she sort of finishes by just talking about the great need to make this a much easier problem to solve. And indeed, everything that her experience bore is reflected in data as well. The majority of Americans will age in their existing homes in part because there is really no alternative. There's not enough facilities. Most people don't want to live in facilities. National surveys show that over close to 90% of people would prefer to age in their existing home. And yet in the home, the most dangerous room by far is the bathroom, for reasons that make sense. It's wet. A lot of activities are done with your eyes closed as you're trying to cleanse yourself. And you do a lot of very intimate things in that space. And that's also where 80% of our falls occur. And so it's just a very challenging space. And so I turned back to sort of just the history of people who worked on this, and there's dozens more, but just calling attention to a few pieces. George Sakier in the 1930s, Bertram Goldberg in the 1940s, and later Gianfranco Zakai in a large contract with Herman Miller in the 90s, a metaphor project. I spoke to him at length to try to learn from the experiences of these existing work in this space. You can see the different vertical and horizontal configurations that people have attempted. In talking to a wide variety of stakeholders, from individuals experiencing these challenges to clinicians who actually work with people who are struggling to make these adaptations at home, including experts in home modification itself who will actually go do that, to business executives who are trying to meet this demand and struggling because of issues in just what's on the market today. Every job ends up being custom, and that's very challenging. But there are interesting forces at play in health plans in the public sector that's now driving a new market for this. And lastly, a handful of different architects, including plumbers and architects and architectural historians. And I started with just very simple 3D sketch models done by hand, trying to understand and think about space, how fixtures come together, quite abstracted, but how could these things be organized vertically, horizontally, single body, stacking, separation in space, sharing a common central channel. I then realized I also had to work on each fixture because the bathroom is obviously a combination of fixtures. And so started similarly doing a series of scaled models in toilet form studies, and then started working just to understand mass and volume in full scale. And this sort of toggling and juxtaposition of scale was, I only learned actually by putting the presentation together. It was clearly part of my process that I hadn't even realized at the time. And eventually these evolved to start to, just as I was working through them, I started to incorporate features without really realizing it, including a curbless, zero threshold sort of shower. The idea of shelving could be important for storage, and how some of these panels could come together, and how there could be even the notion of a panel. And in talking to an architect who made a great point that in general our plumbing systems have evolved, our bathrooms have evolved economical plumbing, not the other way around. And so he really loved this idea of a pre-panelized system. There was some amount of prefabrication, and this intermediary solution where you don't do an entire custom job, you can use that surface as a conduit between everything that happens behind the scenes and the front face of the bathroom that the user experiences. And he made a great call out around the most difficult issue is going to be the soil stack, where waste is moving, and the largest cost would come from whether or not those have to be repositioned. And so I had to go and start really understanding the anatomy of the bathroom. Where are water supply lines running in general? How does the plumbed wall template work? Where is the vent stack? So gases are being vented out, and waste lines in the soil stack, and how do these things come together, and how will they be managed? And in doing that, I had to organize myself around certain constraints. Some of those were structural. As an architect, he talked at length about how most homes are going to have a 5x8 footprint. A system has to work with at least that 5x8 footprint, and that became the base case to sort of work against. Larger combinations could be easy, but if you can't hit that one, you'll miss a decent share of the market. Secondly was just the reality of plumbing and being able to understand all the different sizes and dimensions of tubes and pipes that exist and how those can be accommodated. Third was ergonomics and really thinking about how each fixture and the relationship of these things, the heights of things with relation to each other, are going to be really important and could matter quite a bit. And lastly was materiality, because obviously this is a moist, damp environment. And so the prototypes evolved to explore both the spatial organization, but also the physical connections. And again, this is just sort of a combination of a slightly higher fidelity 1/6 scale model, where now the measurements were actually 1/6 scale of a full bathroom in terms of the fixtures, trying to just work through the ideas, the dimensions of space, trying to just understand how it's really so much more compact than it seems when you're thinking just about it in your head. And then secondly, starting to think about how these actual physical connections would get made. There are studs behind the wall. Things have to attach to those studs. There's pipes running in places. And started just using strut channel to figure out how some of these connections could be made. And I could fasten panels and other things to that securely. And so the idea emerged for a modular system that would effectively meet this combination of goals of achieving something that is very safe and aligned with these ergonomic requirements, but also doesn't compromise a sense of aesthetics, the ability for people to also have some choice in color or things, because again, using materials that enable that to be done rather readily. And so I had to effectively design in 3 different categories: the panels themselves and how those would work, as is featured on the left, all the fixtures and the controls and mechanisms by how they would work, and then lastly a series of accessories that would work with these panels that would all come together in a system. And so just to explain the anatomy of the panelized system, again, there's studs in the back, and then this, in the prototype as well, is just using sheet metal. You could imagine these being extrusions, easily, very much used IKEA as a reference in their rail system for how kitchens are done. Have a rail that attaches to the studs, and then panel brackets that attach to those to provide an incredibly secure connection through which all these other pieces can be connected. The panel then gets connected there, and these openings in the panel become the places where grab bars can be connected, panel connectors can be fitted. The whole shelving concept leverages connections in there, and shelves can slot in place easily. Here, just demonstrating the grab bar. And then when thinking about the fixtures themselves, I decided to take one and go deeper on it. And in that case, I chose the toilet, in part because it was a harder challenge than like a sink or a basin. And there's just a lot more complexity around it. And in talking to occupational therapists, they said this is what's one of the biggest challenges they deal with, and a lot of things are pretty suboptimal. So I used studied a lot of what Kohler is doing in the space, including with these new unibody designs with integrated tanks, different kind of system and technology, but then started thinking through systematically the shapes and contours of the seat, the integration of the bidet, controls that are positioned both in a place and at a height, and with the type of design, lever mechanism that makes it easier if you have dexterity issues in your hands or arthritis to operate. And then of course a height, overall height that sits much higher than a regular toilet in a lot of ways. The shape itself is based on actually Alexander Kira's work in really defining an ideal set of ergonomic constraints whereby the weight of the body is not on the thighs, which is where most common toilet seats are, and severely cuts off circulation, exacerbates constipation, but actually on the sit bones, and that's sort of the contour we see there. And so again, at the system level, a lot of consideration for this as well. The use of a clear horizon line, so separating color. High contrast is often incredibly helpful in these populations. High contrast in the color and a horizon line that separates that makes it easy to see where you are in space. Again, the ability to attach grab bars to some extent within the grid of the system, where you want and where you need. And as we saw in Becca's father's case, he wanted them all over the place, and you could absolutely achieve that here. I also thought about the shower floor a lot, and again, this curbless approach. The design for this came out of a conversation with John Franco, and patents he sent me from his work with Herman Miller, which are now in the public domain. And I made some modifications to that. They've done some very interesting studies on how water, using both the traction that's built into that, but these channels towards the end where you meet the actual bathroom floor, are incredibly effective for eliminating any water that can efflux out of the shower. And there's just another view, you can kind of see that a little better here. But also a sense of space where these objects relate. A lot of things are based on the form of the ellipse. And then importantly, the ability that this would work with rollators, walkers, even a wheelchair. The way this was designed, these cabinets are removable, and you have sort of a slab of vanity there. And it's at the clearance height specifically that enable a wheelchair to roll under. And the sink and the vanity remain at heights that are appropriate for someone in a seated position. And so again, these clearances around the toilet, the logic of the panelization is that it is built in response to code requirements, that you will be 15 inches on center in either direction. So all the logic of assembly and is sort of built into the design of the system. The grab bars are at a height that works for most people, but again, you can customize where exactly those are if you want modifications. But in a base case, that is at 36 inches, as is standard and as we recommended. Just another view in a much larger format bathroom. This could be adapted in a lot of different ways. And so I'd like to end by simply saying that I think how a society designs for its oldest members stands testament to its values and preoccupations. And I think that design begets experience, how we live the contours of a given day. And I don't think there's ever a reason for that experience to not be dignified. And I think the bathroom is one space where we can make major strides to that effect. Thank you.
Yes.